Tutankhamun has become the most famous of all the pharaohs.
Most people, when they think of Tutankhamun, they see all the gold, they see semi-precious stones, they see alabaster vases. The discovery of the tomb was quite rightly perceived as something absolutely sensational and unique and unprecedented.
Ancient Egypt is perceived as unique, and people are drawn to the unique.
Everyone wanted to see Tutankhamun.
However, stories of mysterious events seem to follow the opening of the ancient tomb.
The idea of the mummy's curse is a particularly seductive narrative. I think a lot of people were confirmed in their suspicions that no good would come of disturbing the dead.
And then what better story to tell than that of an aristocrat being struck down by an ancient curse?
Egypt, 1922. After a lengthy 7-year search, Howard Carter, along with his benefactor, Lord Carnarvon, opened the tomb of Tutankhamun. It was the first time in over 3,000 years it had been disturbed.
As the dig progresses, it's not long before Carnarvon starts to develop an illness. The story goes that he got a mosquito bite on a cheek, and that when he was shaving, he caught that mosquito bite, and reopening that wound, it got infected, and that led to blood poisoning.
And then Lord Carnarvon dropped dead.
Almost immediately, the idea that he was the victim of some kind of curse was being put around.
The idea of the mummy's curse quickly gained traction. It was theorized that the Lord's death had been caused by elementals created to guard the royal tomb. For many, it appeared that the boy king's spirit was awoken and sought revenge against the perpetrators.
When Lord Carnarvon died after the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, post-dating that event by a matter of months, I think a lot of people were confirmed in their suspicions that no good would come of disturbing the dead. There's a story that often gets repeated about Carnarvon's dog howling and suddenly dropping down dead at the same moment. There are other stories about various people mysteriously dying or suffering unexpected fates.
Stories flooded newspapers of visitors to the tomb developing illnesses and dying soon after. There were accounts of houses burning down, then flooding upon being rebuilt. It was reported that ancient curses were inscribed within the tomb, warning those who disturbed it.
So Carnarvon's death within a matter of months of the tomb being discovered and opened is the event that gets people talking about the mummy's curse. And interestingly, it's not actually after his death that those rumours start to circulate. People start to speculate about the pharaoh's spirit seeking vengeance for the disturbance of his grave, even while Carnarvon's illness is just being reported in the press. So as soon as Carnarvon starts to get ill, that's when these stories start to circulate.
Howard Carter was an archaeologist who'd worked in Egypt since his late teens. He'd also worked for the Egyptian government as one of the antiquities inspectors, but then had left under something of a cloud in 1905.
Howard Carter was an Egyptologist who didn't have that privilege and upbringing. He was from a very artistic family, but he didn't go to public school, he didn't go to university. So his training was very much on the ground with excavators like Flinders Petrie, who's very famous for developing a rigorous archaeological method. I think for Carter, he had a lot to prove himself a gentleman.
So when he first arrived in Egypt in 1891, when he was only 17 years old, he actually did not arrive as an archaeologist. He didn't work as an archaeologist, but he was hired as an artist, as a draftsman.
Around the same kind of time, the Earl of Carnarvon had taken up an interest in Egyptology and had obtained permission to undertake excavations.
The fifth Earl of Carnarvon is an aristocrat, born with a title. He becomes interested in Egypt very early in the 20th century.
So the reason Carnarvon was in the position to excavate, in the financial position, was that he was married to a woman called Amina Wombwell, and she was in all likelihood the illegitimate daughter of the American banker Alfred de Rothschild. And so when they got married, he put up a very nice dowry of £500,000 which is nowadays equivalent to about 70 million. And that enabled the couple to, live very nicely, travel, collect antiquities, and also excavate. And Carnarvon made it to the point where he realized that he needs expert help.
Carter was introduced to Carnarvon, and the two of them henceforth worked together as a team.
One had the financial support but not the expertise, the other one had the expertise but not the money, and they were kind of a match made in heaven.
In the 1920s and 1930s, Egypt is a playground for the rich and famous, the elite. So what you get is people travelling to Egypt for those winter months when the weather is really, really nice, and essentially schmoozing and partying and having a really good time in European-style hotels. Very glamorous, very modern. And just enjoying this really quite fabulous social scene. So there is this political friction, this social friction between Egyptians and Europeans at the time. The British invaded Egypt back in 1882 and have essentially been in charge since that time. Egyptian independence is on the horizon, but certainly when it comes to excavations, these become particular moments of national importance where we see Egyptian nationalists seizing on the pharaohs as symbols of Egyptian identity and, in theory, freedom, whereas the British, the French and other Europeans still hold these really significant roles in, say, the museums and antiquities services in Egypt at the time. So certainly a time of friction between Egyptians and Europeans.
So Carnarvon and Howard Carter wanted to work in the Valley of the Kings. The problem was that the excavation permission was in the hands of Theodore Davis, who was an American lawyer, a businessman, come archaeologist, exploring more than 30 tombs, royal and non-royal tombs.
The Valley of the Kings has, you could tell by the name, a certain reputation for where particular members of Egyptian royalty are buried.
The Valley of the Kings is a wadi, which is basically a dried up watercourse on the west bank near the modern city of Luxor. And from the beginning of the Egyptian 18th dynasty, which is around about 1500 BC, it had been the place for the burial of Egyptian kings. Prior to this, kings had generally been buried under pyramids, but those were no longer being used, and instead the royal tomb comprised a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and then a couple of kilometres away, a temple for the worship of the king's spirit.
The first map of the Valley of the Kings and the first plan of the tombs that were known at this time was made in 1799 by members of Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. Then, throughout the 19th century, the European exploration of the Valley of the Kings continued. Of course, it was hampered by the fact that already in antiquity, the majority of basically all of the royal tombs had been robbed. Theodore Davis considered the Valley of the Kings to be exhausted, so he gave up his excavation permit, and then Lord Carnarvon applied for it, got granted. He signed it in early 1915.
He knew that the valley had been extensively excavated over the previous century and a half. However, he was aware there were a number of areas that had not yet been investigated. And he was also aware that there were a handful of kings whose tombs were unknown.
Due to the outbreak of the First War, there was a small delay.
So Carter and Carnarvon, who were both excavating before the war, paused excavations during the war, during which time Carnarvon was actually hosting events like spiritualist seances in his ancestral seat in Highclere Castle. And after the First World War, excavations resumed, and it's after the First World War, fairly soonish after its conclusion, that the tomb of Tutankhamun is discovered.
The first thing that Howard Carter did was that he created a map, and then through the seasons they would excavate from the surface down to the bedrock to make sure not to miss anything, grid square by grid square.
The discovery of the tomb was basically the result of systematic clearance. There was an area which hadn't been touched, partly because it was right in front of another tomb which was very popular with tourists.
Archaeologists and tourists don't go together very well, so archaeologists had always tried to avoid it. And Carter's solution was just to start the excavation season a little bit earlier, before the tourist season kicked in. So he started on the 1st of November in 1922.
So basically they started clearing down through the debris, then finding a layer of which contained the remains of workmen's huts, which probably dated to 200 or 300 years after Tutankhamun's time. And then under that level, where they were getting down to the original bedrock, one of the workmen spotted something which looked like the edge of a step. Carter confirmed that, and the stairway leading into Tutankhamun's tomb was then revealed.
On the morning of the 4th of November, the first step of a staircase was discovered, a rock-cut staircase. And so on the evening of the 4th of November, he writes into his diary, the only time ever he scribbles all over the page. Instead of writing very neatly, he writes down the now famous words, "First steps of tomb found." They started clearing what proved to be a rock-cut stairway until he hit a plastered door. And then on the 5th of November, he did something quite superhuman. He decided that he cannot continue and has to wait until his sponsor and his friend, Lord Carnarvon, is present as well.
So they're waiting for Carnarvon to come over with his daughter to get to the tomb, and they're not going to peer inside, they're not going to make that first hole until Carnarvon is present. And so everyone's waiting. You can only imagine how much anticipation characterised the atmosphere.
And then on the morning of the 26th of November, it was finally time that Howard Carter made a tiny breach into the doorway, and then became the first person after 3,000 years to look inside the tomb of Tutankhamun. He describes this moment very vividly in his excavation journal. When Lord Carnarvon asked him, "Can you see anything?" he said, "Yes, it is wonderful."
initial view which Carter had into the first chamber was that it was a rectangular room filled with objects.
When the tomb was first opened, it's quite a cramped space, it was quite a busy space. A lot of objects were stacked up against each other, stacked up against the wall.
It was likened to a townhouse which had been closed up for the summer. The range of material found in the tomb was quite extraordinary. You have things intimately related to the mummy, so therefore you've got the nest of coffins in which it was housed, the great sarcophagus within that which they were housed, and also the containers for the mummified intestines of the king.
Tutankhamun's funerary mask, which sat directly atop his mummified remains, is one of the most famous Egyptological artefacts of all time, and I think it captures the popular imagination because of its glamorous gold quality.
Before the discovery of his tomb, Tutankhamun was known to have been a minor king of the late 14th century BC. However, his exact relationships were unclear. He was certainly a son-in-law of the so-called heretic king Akhenaten, but whether he was a member of the royal family or simply a nobleman who'd married a princess was unknown.
So what was known was that he had a very short reign. He probably reigned only for 10 years and died quite young.
So a very short reign, but one in which, crucially, we see a reversal of the religious reforms brought in by his father. So a return to polytheism, so multiple deities, rather than monotheism, a single deity which was brought in by Akhenaten.
I think the value of the discovery in terms of what have we learned about Tutankhamun lies in the fact that there were quite a lot of personal items in the tomb that actually really give us a glimpse of that person. So, you know, he wasn't only king, he was also a human being. And I'm always quite touched by some of the finds in his tomb. There is, for instance, small furniture clearly made for a child. There is a box for shaving equipment that says for His Majesty when he was a boy, so it probably contained his first shaving equipment. There's also a lock of hair of his grandmother, T, in the tomb. And then, of course, sadly, there are also the mummified remains of his two prematurely born daughters.
To me, the most significant artefacts found within that tomb are the bodies of Tutankhamun's daughters. So we have two miniature sarcophagi, two miniature coffins inside are two babies.
Most people, when they think of Tutankhamun, they see all the gold, they see semi-precious stones, they see alabaster vases. But a lot of the material was actually organic material. So we're talking about linen, clothes, robes, even Tutankhamun's underwear, more than 100 pairs of them. There were shoes made of leather. Of course, inside the vases, you had perfumes and oils.
So the ancient Egyptians believed that after death, their heart would be weighed against the feather of truth. And to get to the underworld, that would have to balance favourably. If it didn't balance favourably, they would be eaten by a devourer entity. So hopefully you get past the first stage. And then when you get to the afterlife, you enjoy eternal life, in theory, with all of the things with which you are buried and what they represent. So you find people buried with food and drink, you find people buried often with multiple shabtis, which are little humanoid pieces which represent servants or people who will do various tasks for you in the afterlife. So the more you are buried with, supposedly the nicer and more luxurious your afterlife would be. The objects within the tomb were preserved to an incredible degree. Obviously, this is a tomb that has been almost entirely undisturbed, and as a result, these very delicate artefacts remain almost captured like a snapshot in time. On the other hand, it does mean that there are some things in there that are incredibly delicate.
The one thing which was in a very, very bad condition was the king's mummy. And this was due to the fact that the ancient priests had poured large amounts of unguent, which is various sacred oils, all over the body before they closed the coffin. And those sacred oils had carbonised and gradually almost burnt parts of the mummy's flesh. Also, those oils had completely solidified, so that when it came to trying to unwrap the mummy actually had to be cut to pieces to actually get it out of the coffin and out of its wrappings.
One of the things that people don't tend to know about Tutankhamun's remains is that in the process of removing them from their coffin, they were actually broken up into lots of pieces. His arms, for instance, he was also severed at the hips. His head was removed from his body. The excavators themselves essentially glued the pieces of his body back together. I think that's one of the things, one of the parts of the story that's been deliberately obscured, because people find that idea so horrifying that we would treat human remains in that way.
The world reaction to the tomb of Tutankhamun was, of course, absolutely spectacular, phenomenal. The general public reacted in an unprecedented way. And it's important to keep in mind that, of course, this was the first time an event like this was transmitted around the globe in real time. The discovery also had a major impact on popular culture. In every sector, literature, theatre, in fashion, in design, you name it.
The discovery of the tomb sparked a wave of Egyptomania. This ranged from fashion to music to advertising. Egyptomania is the term that people use to describe a fascination for ancient Egypt, which can actually be quite divorced from ancient Egypt as it existed as an ancient civilization. It's the ancient Egypt of the imagination. It's a fantastical take on ancient Egypt. And often this falls back to stereotypes, like this idea of an exotic culture, an orientalized, erotic culture often as well, and often falling back to tropes of Egypt being a place of despotism in the Bible. So actually Egyptomania doesn't necessarily represent ancient Egypt as it was, but a version of it that can be quite dark, dangerous. And that often is the version of Egypt that captures the popular imagination.
So tourists flooded the Valley of the Kings. Everyone wanted to see Tutankhamun, children, academics, journalists, royalty alike. And so the wish to report on the tomb and the discovery from the side of the media was massive as well. Journalists, like the tourists, flooded the Valley of the Kings, trying to get a picture of the archaeologists or objects when they left the tomb. And in the first months, this all happened in a very chaotic way.
The excavators were besieged by journalists wanting a story. This led to the Earl of Carnarvon making the Times newspaper the only route for news to come out of the excavation team.
And so that meant that only the journalist from the Times was allowed to make the official interviews with the excavators. And only the Times got the official photographs that were taken by Harry Burton. And then the other newspapers had to buy the photographs of the Times. And as you can imagine, that very much angered and alienated not only the foreign but also the Egyptian press.
The reason the deal with the Times caused controversy in Egypt is because the Egyptians weren't being given access to information about their own cultural heritage, and politically this was seen as a real misstep because the British are being fed this information directly, which the Egyptians are then getting secondhand. So there really was a two-tier system. And it was the British press, specifically the Times, that were getting all of the information, all of the interviews, and the Egyptian press and other news outlets who were coming to the table second.
But this just simply annoyed people and also led probably almost directly to the legend of the curse of Tutankhamun.
Hanging over the excavation party was a pall of superstition that threatened the progress of the expedition at every turn. The native laborers felt sure that this desecration of early graves would bring only tragedy to all involved. Fighting that feeling as well as the blazing desert sun, Carter ruled with an iron fist and was hard-pressed to keep the work going. Then finally, on February 16th, 1923, King Tut's fabulous tomb was unearthed. Carloads of relics, as well as the young king's mummy, were removed. Loaded aboard barges, the priceless treasures were shipped down the Nile to Cairo and the safety of the museum. The world anxiously awaited the slowly moving water caravan carrying its fabulous cargo. Carter and Carnarvon had won the battle against superstition and nature. Shortly afterward, Lord Carnarvon died of a mysterious fever. Mystics the world over, led by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, cried out that the tomb's curse had claimed its desecrator, although medical science records that the English lord died of pneumonia brought on by infected mosquito bites.
And so what happens is we start to get this almost snowballing where anybody with any connection whatsoever to the tomb, whether they visited it briefly or whether they were an excavator involved in the dig, as soon as anything bad happens to them, it just gets attributed to the mummy's curse. But I think the idea of the mummy's curse is a particularly seductive narrative because burial sites of the ancient Egyptian dead, of royalty in particular, are so lavish.
From the beginning, people were interested in ancient Egypt. It was very clear that ancient Egyptian funerary beliefs played a very crucial role in ancient Egyptian culture. And it was known that, ancient Egyptians prepared very carefully for their journey through the underlife, or they had a very distinct idea about what comes after death. So already in Victorian times, this was perceived as a crucial element of ancient Egyptian culture. In the Victorian society, people did indulge in events like mummy unwrappings, and the idea of ancient Egyptian curses already existed.
After the enormous losses of the First World War is we see a resurgence in interest in spiritualism. Spiritualism is the belief that we can contact the deceased after they've died. What you start to see is spiritualists claiming that Tutankhamun's spirit is communicating with them. This is particularly interesting, I think, given that Lord Carnarvon himself was a spiritualist.
In the early 1920s, so people had just gone through a global pandemic, also through a war where a lot of young men had died very early on. It was a time when the discovery of the remains of a very young man who had also died prematurely very much resonated in the Western world. And also, quite frankly, people wanted to be distracted. We're talking about a time with severe economic problems. Life wasn't easy. And I think it's simply part of human nature that when the opportunity comes, people like to be distracted. And then what better story to tell than that of an aristocrat being struck down by an ancient curse? I think that the discovery of the tomb was quite rightly perceived as something absolutely sensational and unique and unprecedented. It really was the first time that a royal tomb was discovered more or less intact. And Carter was swamped in letters and telegrams, and Tutmania kicked in. And all of that very much prepared the grounds for, of course, that's the moment when myths are created. I think this is something that is really important to be considered when it comes to the birth of the curse of Tutankhamun. The other newspapers didn't have their own story to tell, but finally with the curse, they had their own story to tell.
The press has an absolute field day, and the people who are interviewed by the press, crucially, who push the story of supernatural forces at work, who suggest that there are secret hidden poisons within the tomb, are authors who have themselves written stories about vengeful ancient Egyptian entities, people like Marie Corelli and Arthur Conan Doyle. So one of the things that you see after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, and certainly after the death of Lord Carnarvon in 1923, is a republication of lots of 19th century texts, specifically Victorian texts, which feature these ancient Egyptian antagonists. So Marie Corelli's novel Ziska from 1897 is republished. You also get Arthur Conan Doyle's mummy story, Lot number 249, which comes out again. So you could very skeptically look at this and think that these authors have an interest in the mummy's curse because their work will be republished. There may be some kind of financial incentive to speak to the papers and push those theories, but certainly in terms of what people want to consume, audiences were returning to this fiction and rereading it again in light of contemporary events. But I think ancient Egypt captures so many occult imaginations in the late 19th, early 20th centuries because of its very complicated funerary rites. So the Book of the Dead becomes incredibly popular with occultists. I think ideas of the various components of the soul in ancient Egypt, so things like the ka, being able to exit the body and almost functioning as a kind of double of the body, felt quite a lot like the concept of astral projection, of being able to kind of leave one's body and go somewhere else. So I think there were lots of concepts that really appealed to occultists that seemed to chime with ideas that they were interested in, and they could chart that back in theory to an ancient Egyptian origin point and almost give a kind of authority or authenticity to what they themselves were doing. Simply put, the evidence that the curse is more fiction than fact is the average life expectancy of people who were involved in the excavations. So there's actually been a medical study which looked at the average age of death of the people involved with the tomb and the average age of death in the general population. And they found that you were slightly more likely to die a little bit younger if you were involved in the Tutankhamun excavations. But statistically speaking, there was nothing really in it.
So we are looking at a period of time without vaccines, without any antiviral drugs, even without any antibiotics. Penicillin was only developed in 1928. The average life expectancy of a man in the 1920s and 30s was 60. So looking at the people, the photographer Harry Burton died aged 60 of diabetes. The engineer Arthur Callender died aged 60. Arthur Mace died a few years after he left the excavation team. He worked on the tomb from 1922 to 1924, but he already left for health reasons. He was suffering from pleurisy and then died of tuberculosis. Looking at Carter himself, he died in 1939, aged 64, from Hodgkin's disease. The most prominent case is obviously Lord Carnarvon, He was bitten by a mosquito, and then while he was shaving, the wound got infected, got blood poisoning, which developed into pneumonia, and then he died. Lord Carnarvon died on the 5th of April 1923. Arthur Mace left the excavation team in 1924, but the mummified body of Tutankhamun was actually not unwrapped until November 1925. So neither Mace nor Carnarvon ever saw or came in contact with the body of Tutankhamun.
The question as to why the curse got so popular is a really interesting one, and I think we get a sense of perhaps imperial guilt on the part of the British and other Europeans, the sense that disturbing these resting places is something that actually feels uncomfortable, and you start to see people writing to newspapers saying, surely we shouldn't be doing this, and surely we shouldn't be putting mummified remains in museums in glass cases. It's not what those individuals would have wanted. So we definitely get more of a sense of a moral grey area that people are exploring here, and I wonder whether some of the curse stories is responding to that discomfort, actually.
It's worthwhile noting that the Egyptians did actually include curses in some tombs, but they were normally against the embezzlement of funerary endowments rather than anything to do with actually penetrating a tomb.
One of the things that the ancient Egyptians believed was that the body had to remain intact and that you needed everything for the afterlife to be buried with you. So there are instances where you get people protecting their burials and say, you know, don't come and disturb these remains or all of my things, or bad things will happen to you. But certainly not the mummy's curse as we know it as a modern cultural phenomenon. There are other stories of supposedly unlucky artefacts that cause people to suffer misfortune and premature death, certainly in the 19th century and early 20th century before the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. So one famous example concerns an artefact which is held in the British Museum. It's referred to as the unlucky mummy, colloquially, but it's actually a wooden mummy board, so it's not human remains at all. It's a wooden resemblance of an individual which would sit atop their body in the sarcophagus. The unlucky mummy's been tied to loads of accidents that have befallen people over the years, and supposedly it was given to the British Museum to stop its previous owner from suffering these misfortunes themselves. So it was donated to the British Museum to get it out of the house, essentially. The unlucky mummy has such an interesting, again, snowballing of mythology surrounding it, that you actually get one Egyptologist, Margaret Murray, where she told some Egyptology students that this mummy board had actually been on the Titanic when it sank. But of course, it never was. It's just an instance of an Egyptologist telling a spooky story. And of course, this is exactly the kind of thing that gets repeated and goes down through the decades ad nauseam. Yes, there were some very high-profile deaths connected to the Tutankhamun excavations, but we all have to die someday, and it may just be after we've entered an Egyptian tomb.
It took Howard Carter and his team altogether 10 years to fully excavate the tomb, to clear it, to transport the objects to Cairo. And this is a number I think many people are not aware of. Archaeology is not what Indiana Jones is doing in the movies. As much as I love the films, but we do not run into a temple, grab a goblet and run out again. So instead, we have a lot of specialists on excavations, and we produce thousands of records.
Following the discovery of the tomb, the objects were progressively taken to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Then, as we moved into the 1960s, a number of exhibitions of material from the tomb started to leave Egypt.
So in terms of the exhibitions themselves, the amounts of objects from Tutankhamun's tomb is enormous. And so there's a very careful curation process in terms of what actually gets selected and what travels around the world. And of course, those most famous artifacts, like Tutankhamun's funerary mask, is just going to be one of those artifacts that people want to see all over the world. And so when you see photographs of the exhibitions themselves, you see photographs of particularly that most famous artifact, the funerary mask, with celebrities, royalty, politicians the most famous and important and powerful people all over the world engaging with these symbols of power and absolute monarchy in really interesting symbolic ways.
Our persisting interest and fascination for ancient Egypt comes partly from its recognisability. It's one of the few cultures where almost anybody can recognise it. It's got a certain number of icons which have passed into international culture. But there's also this underlying sort of feeling of mystery.
In most countries in the Western world, in North America, if you go to a bigger museum, you will find an Egyptian collection. So it is very accessible. Ancient Egypt is part of school curriculum. Kids already grow up with ancient Egypt.
If you walk around museum displays devoted to ancient Egypt, we almost see one of two stories cropping up. The first is that they were just like us. So you walk into the gallery and you see ancient Egyptian eyeliner and you think, oh yeah, just like me. The other story, of course, is one that's very different. You walk into a gallery and the story that is curated for you is these people are very different to us. And I think that difference is something that people find utterly captivating.
Ancient Egypt is perceived as unique, and people are drawn to the unique.
This idea of a very complex funerary culture, this idea of monumentality, and the idea of Egypt that actually perhaps isn't quite historically accurate, but the version of Egypt we have in our heads, which is kind of gilded and luxurious and opulent, despite the fact that the gilded artifacts, the opulence, is reserved for the elite few. So I think it is those two different stories that work in tandem. They're just like us, but they're so different. And I think we yearn for that connection, but we're also really struck and startled by that huge gulf, I think, that separates us and them.
And then on top of that, I think there are unfortunately also a lot of things that, I would call stereotypes. That's what people are fascinated with, and which as an Egyptologist I find very hard to help people to overcome the stereotypes and see that there is so much more to ancient Egypt than just gold and mummies and pyramids.